On May 5th, 1934, as time ran out, Bonnie Parker sat down and began to write her story with Clyde, what they had been through in the last 2 years, how they became what they were, how they knew what was going to happen to them, and what would happen 2 weeks later in Louisiana. The story of Bonnie and Clyde. You've read the story of Jesse James, of how he lived and died. If you're still in need of something to read, here's the story of Bonnie and Clyde. Now, Bonnie and Clyde are the Barrow Gang. I'm sure you all have read. How they rob and steal, and those who squeal are usually found dying or dead. There's lots of untruths to these write-ups. They're not as ruthless as that. Their nature is raw. They hate all the law, the stool pigeons, spotters, and rats. They call them cold-blooded killers. They say they are heartless and mean. But I say this with pride, that I once knew Clyde, when he was honest and upright and clean. But the law fooled around, kept taking him down, and locking him up in a cell, till he said to me, I'll never be free, so I'll meet a few of them in hell. The road was so dimly lighted. There were no highway signs to guide, but they made up their minds, if all roads were blind, they wouldn't give up till they died. The road gets dimmer and dimmer. Sometimes you can hardly see. Still it's fight, man to man, and do all you can, for they know that they can never be free. If they try to act like citizens and rent them a nice little flat, about the third night they're invited to fight by a submachine gun rat-tat-tat-tat. If a policeman is killed in Dallas, and they have no clues for a guide, if they can't find a fiend, they just wipe the slate clean and hang it on Bonnie and Clyde. 2 crimes have been done in America, not a credit to the Barrow mob, for they had no hand in the kidnapping demand or the Kansas City depot job. A newsboy once said to his buddy, I wished old Clyde would get jumped. In this awful hard times, we might make a few dimes if 5 or 6 laws get bumped. The police haven't got the report yet. Clyde sent a wireless today, saying we have a peace flag of white. We stretch out at night. We have joined the NRA. They don't think they are too tough or desperate. They know the law always wins. They have been shot at before, but they do not ignore that death is the wages of sin. From heartbreak some people have suffered. From weariness some people have died. But take it all in all, our troubles are small till we get like Bonnie and Clyde. Someday they will go down together, and they will bury them side by side. To a few it means grief, to the law relief, but it is death to Bonnie and Clyde. Drive to Gippsland and drop Henry off with his family, and that's when they go back and see their families for the last time. I want to tell you here what Emma said about the last time she saw Bonnie. She wrote about this in her book Fugitives, which she wrote in 1934. She said they saw them for the last time on Sunday, May 6th. They came by the filling station, told everybody where to meet them. They met 4 miles east of down a country road. Emma said the visit lasted about 2 hours. She sat on the ground beside Bonnie, under the stars, and just talked. As they talked, she said Bonnie was showing her some photographs that they had recently taken. And I'm quoting the book here. Quote, Mama, she began, with that peculiar calm which she and Clyde were always in when speaking of death. When they kill us, don't let them take me to an undertaking parlor, will you? Bring me home. I reached out and seized her wrist and jerked her toward me. Don't, Bonnie, for God's sake, I cried. I wanted to scream. There she sat, so young, so lovely, only 23, with the May moonlight sifting through her yellow hair and making shadows on her cheeks. There she sat and talked to me of death as calmly as if she were discussing going to the grocery store. Bonnie looked up at me and smiled. It was a funny smile, as if she were 1,000,000 years older than I was, as if she knew things that I'd never learn if I lived for centuries. As if this flutter I was making about the talk of death was rather childish, and so to be excused. Now, Mama, don't get upset. Why shouldn't we talk it over? It's coming. You know it. I know it. All of Texas knows it. So don't let them keep me at the undertaker's. Bring me home when I die. It's been so long since I was home. I want to lie in the front room with you and Billy and Buster sitting beside me. A long, cool, peaceful night together before I leave you. That will be nice and restful. Then she took one of the pictures and she gave it to her mom, and she said, I like this one. So one of Clyde holding her up. They're both laughing. She said, quote, Bonnie's red lacquered fingers caressed the surface of the picture slowly. And another thing, Mama. When they kill us, don't ever say anything ugly about Clyde. Please promise me that too. This is when Bonnie hands over the poem, the story of Bonnie and Clyde. Then they said goodbye, the last time, and they drove away. 2 weeks later, they would be back home just like they promised. Only that time they wouldn't be alive. Which Bonnie and Clyde would be killed in was stolen on April 29th, 1934 from a driveway at 2107 Gabler Street in Topeka, Kansas. As it sat in the driveway of Ruth and Jesse Warren, there were 1,243 miles on the odometer. Ruth had just mentioned to a neighbor that since it had, quote, gone 1,243 miles, now we can step it up. Back then, you had to break in the engine before you could really see what it could do. Mrs. Warren had been driving around that afternoon. She got home. She pulled into the driveway, which was behind the house, parked her car, and left the keys in the ignition. Neighbors saw a Plymouth pull up after she went inside. There were a man and woman in the front seat, and a third man standing on the running board. The car slowed down just enough for that man to step off, hop in the driver's seat, and drive away with Ruth Warren's car. She was confused about where her car went. She called her husband Jesse to ask, Did you stop by and take the car? He said, Absolutely not. Their 6-week-old Ford Model 40 four-door sedan was gone. It's the last car Bonnie and Clyde ever stole. By the time Jesse and Ruth Warren got their car back, 7,612 miles had been added. That averages out to 300 miles a day since Bonnie and Clyde had taken it. Bonnie had her final permanent around May 15th at a beauty shop located on the corner of Elm Street and Market in Winsboro, Texas. The beauty shop was owned by a Ms. Dickens. She said a Ford V8 pulled up in front. Bonnie got out, came in, said she wanted to have her hair done. Ms. Dickens was afraid to do it. She said Bonnie had a wound on her scalp on the right side of her head from a bullet. That probably was an injury from the botched Sowers Road ambush. And so Ms. Dickens said, I'm scared to do that for you. I'm afraid you won't like it. Bonnie said, don't worry about it. Just do it, and we'll see what happens. The whole time she was doing her hair, Clyde was outside, sitting in the car most of the time, having the car running, constantly looking up and down the street, making sure everything was safe. She said she got done. She showed it to her in the mirror. Bonnie was happy with what she had done. Bonnie paid her, got back in the car, and drove away. And that is the new permanent Bonnie had the day they were killed. Her hair was dyed a shade of red, but I don't know if Miss Dickens did that. Bonnie's natural color was a dirty blonde. After they were dressed and ready, I'm sure Bonnie did her makeup immaculately. They got in the car. Clyde took his shoes off to drive. He may have laid them next to him because he was going to have to put them back on to go inside the restaurant. But he never drove with shoes on because of his missing toes. He put on sunglasses, and they headed to Gippsland to go to the cafe for them. At the ambush site, Hamer and the men were just waiting for them to happen by. They had set Ivy Methvin's Model A at the side of the road with one of the tires removed. and jacked it up like it had a flat tire. Ivy was probably waiting with the ambushers in the same weeds that they were, and when they saw the car coming, they probably sent him out to stand by the truck. They didn't know when they were coming. They just knew they were at some point going to head toward that house, and they were waiting by that road all night long. Bob Alcorn was at the front of the group so that he could help identify them as the right people. But the main way they planned on knowing it was them is that Clyde would be the only person on earth willing to drive 70 miles per hour on this rutted, rough road, ready to give up. They thought they're not coming by today. And it was about 9:15 that they heard the sound of a V8. They pulled up. Bonnie had a BLT sandwich. Clyde either got a BLT or a bologna sandwich, a fried bologna sandwich. I've read a couple of versions of what happened in the cafe. In one book, it's theorized that Clyde left Bonnie in the car to save time, because it would have been a bigger hassle to get her in there with her busted leg than just going in himself and buying them to go. But in John Neal Phillips' book, he says they got there around 8. They went in and had donuts and coffee. Then they bought the sandwiches and took them with them to go for lunch later on. I'm not sure what to tell you about that, except to say there's two different versions. I think in general, John Neal Phillips is considered the best, at least according to Bonnie's niece. Their hunger satisfied, they got back in the car. Clyde took his shoes off, threw them in the back seat. Bonnie had discarded her tam in the back seat. Clyde had his hat on. He put on sunglasses. On his left-hand side by the door, he had a 20-gauge shotgun. On his right-hand side, between him and Bonnie, propped upright in the floorboard, where he could easily grab it, was a 16-gauge shotgun. Any gun in the car would have been Clyde's. Bonnie was mostly the mule. She kept them handy for him. Sometimes she would hide one on her person, such as a small pistol under her skirt. And it said there may have been a small pistol strapped to her leg on this day, because police were less likely to search a woman. Bonnie had taken a couple of bites of her sandwich, then wrapped it back up. She had a pack of her favorite cigarettes in her lap, Camels, and a map in her lap. I'm not sure what she was using that for, unless they were planning wherever they were going after they reconnected with Henry. They should not have needed a map to get to the hideout. And a handgun lay nearby. After nearly 2 days, hiding in weeds, cleaning and re-cleaning their weapons, waiting for Clyde to show up and having nothing to show for it, they finally hear the sound of a car. Alcorn put field glasses up to his eyes to take a look. The car was going very fast. Alcorn said, "This is it. It's him." The men were ordered this way. Alcorn was first. Hinton was next to him, followed by Oakley and Henderson Jordan, then Manny Galt and Frank Hamer on the other end. Henderson Jordan and Prentice Oakley wanted to give them a chance to surrender, but the Texas guys said there's no way. Clyde will not give up. He has escaped from 12 different shootouts. He will not surrender. But to his dying day, Prentice Oakley was bothered by the fact that they weren't given a chance to surrender, at least had it offered. Clyde pulled up and slowed next to the truck, which they had placed in Clyde's lane facing the wrong direction. He pulled up next to it and put the car in neutral, had a little conversation with Iverson Methvin. At the same time he was pulling up, a logging truck was coming this direction, and they were going to meet. And this road, 2 vehicles could not drive by at the same time. Somebody had to stop to let the other by. And the logging truck stopped to give Clyde the right-of-way. But all of a sudden, Methvin cupped his hands to his belly and backed toward the woods. This was the signal they had come up with. It seemed like he was going to get sick or something, and he went behind the truck. This is when Prentice Oakley stood up. The other 5 followed him. They were about 20 feet away from Clyde. Deputy Oakley panicked and opened fire. And once the shooting started, everybody started shooting. Clyde's head snapped back because he was hit with that first shot right in his left temple, and it went out the other side of his head. It went all the way through. And it's at that point that Bonnie started to scream, in Hamer's words, like a panther. At this moment, I think, this is completely my own personal theory, but somehow Bonnie's right hand was blown off. But all the shots were coming from the left side of the car. I think in that instance, when she realized that Clyde had been hit, that she turned toward him and put that right hand toward Clyde, whether to touch him or grab him, and two bullets actually caught her right hand and just destroyed it. She also had a bullet wound in her right shoulder that may have come from this as well. Bonnie had several shots in her left shoulder, as well as into her chest, under her arm, which broke a rib or two. This must have forced her toward the passenger side door, almost laying flat. And the reason I think this is because the shot she took to the mouth, at the left-hand corner of her mouth, exited out the top of her head, which has to mean she was practically laying down with her head toward the door, depending on the angle of the shot, of course. Because Clyde died instantly, his foot fell off of the pedals, and the car gradually began rolling forward. Hinton said the thought entered his head, "My God, he's going to get away again." They emptied their rifles into the car. When they ran out of that, they got out their shotguns, and for the most part then were shooting at the back of the car as it continued to roll forward. Because there aren't a huge number of shots in the actual back of the car, I think they mostly stayed along the left-hand side of the car, shooting through that back door at an angle toward Bonnie. And I suspect possibly the shots in the windshield, maybe those bullets from the back exiting out the windshield. I know there is a story about Hamer, when it was all done, walking around the front of the car and pumping a bunch of shots into Bonnie, but if she had any wounds in the front, they are not in the coroner report. And Clyde did not have any wounds in the front at all. And I'm basing this on his shirt, which survives. It's just a theory without being able to actually look at it to see if they were entry or exit. There's really no way to know that. The car continued to roll for about 100 yards, gradually pulling to the left until it rolled into a ditch so close that they couldn't open the driver's side door. During the shooting, Bob Alcorn and Ted Hinton accidentally walked into the road in the line of fire from the other guys, and Alcorn started screaming for everybody to stop shooting. Nobody heard him, and it is a miracle that neither one of them got hit. The sound must have been absolutely deafening. 6 BARs going off at the same time, followed by their shotguns, and then their pistols. It sounds like they followed along behind the car until they had no more ammunition. They all were temporarily deafened. Ted Hinton went to the driver's side, saw that he couldn't get the door opened. Clyde was slumped forward with his head over the steering wheel. Clyde couldn't have used his shotgun if he'd wanted to. It had been hit by a bullet in its firing mechanism. This is the one on his left-hand side leaned up against the door. The barrel of the other one rested against his leg. I don't think he had time to touch either one. He leapt over the hood and opened the door on Bonnie's side. She was slumped forward with her head between her knees, like people do when they're about to pass out. But this is what he said he saw. "I see her falling out of the open door. A beautiful and petite young girl who is soft and warm, with hair carefully fixed, and I smell a light perfume against the burnt cordite smell of gunpowder, the sweet and unreal smell of blood. I stand her up, full standing, a tiny frail girl she seems now, and I cannot believe that I do not really feel her breathing. But I look into her face and I see that she is dead. I carefully put her down in the car seat once more. On the floor in front of Bonnie is a pistol that is streaked with the rose color of blood. Her right hand has been shot away, and her young face is ashen gray, except for the bright stain of blood from the awful blasts of shot and the reflection of pink from the flicker of sun on the red dress that is stained with blood and made a darker hue. I straighten and see the other officers, and I know now that the job is done, and they know it, and there is time now to think it through, of all that really happened in a blazing 12 seconds at 9:15 in the morning on a lonely road south of Gippsland in Louisiana, on May 23rd, 1934. Ted Hinton had a movie camera, and he began filming. I do think maybe he sat her upright for a moment, and then that's how she ended up leaning over onto Clyde in the video he takes. Clyde has also been leaned back from the steering wheel in that video footage and in the photographs taken afterwards. He takes views of the car, the road, the general vicinity around them. He catches footage of the guys going through the contents of the car. They inventoried what was in there. There were 3 Browning automatic rifles, 2 sawed-off shotguns, those were the ones in the front seat, a Colt 38 automatic pistol, a Colt 45 double-action revolver, 7 Colt 45 automatic pistols, 100 Browning automatic rifle clips, 3,000 rounds of ammunition for various other firearms. There were also magazines, road maps, blankets, stacks of clothes, all of Bonnie's makeup, Clyde's saxophone. After the shooting, Henderson Jordan and Prentice Oakley left to go to Arcadia to summon the coroner. His name was Dr. J. L. Wade. Ted Hinton went with Frank Hamer to Gibbsland to get a wrecker to come back and get the car. Their bodies sit in this car for 2 hours before the wrecker arrives. And that's one reason the letter I read in one of my previous videos talks about the advanced decomposition, the smell, and all that loveliness. A local man named Mert Davis overhears this call. He goes and tells all of his friends, and they pile into 4 different cars and head to the site to do some gawking and souvenir hunting. When Davis got there, he said the passenger door was open, and there were a handful of people standing around. He moved in, and the officers closed the door. And then someone else opened it, and the officers ordered them to shut it, and it wouldn't shut successfully, and they figured out that Bonnie's hand had fallen into the way. This is the hand that had been shot, and the lawman had to shout at them, "Stop!" He comes in, he puts her hand back in her lap, and they close the door. By the time the coroner got there, he could hardly even get in. There were cars everywhere, there were pedestrians. Souvenir hunters had been chipping away at trees, trying to dig bullets out of them. Almost all of the glass on Clyde's side of the car had been taken. People were taking shell casings. They were going through the shrubbery, looking for bullet fragments, anything they could find. People were already starting to cut off pieces of clothing, Bonnie's hair. By the time they got to Arcadia, her hair had just been hacked to pieces. And they had to grab and restrain a man trying to cut off Clyde's trigger finger and his ears. The wrecker moved in, backed up the rig, hooked the car up. Police vehicles followed behind the wrecker, followed by 200 local cars and trucks. After Bonnie and Clyde died, they towed the car right back the way Bonnie and Clyde had come, and they came right by this school. The elementary school is in the same place. This is not the same building. The kids had absolutely no idea what they were running out to see. Polly Palmer was 12 years old when this happened. She thought maybe it was lunchtime. She just ran out with the other kids. She didn't know what they were going to see, something about bandits from Texas. She'd never heard of Bonnie and Clyde. She jumped up on the running board on Bonnie's side of the car to find herself just inches from the face of Bonnie Parker. She had nightmares for years after this. And she said, quote, "I wish I had never gone out to that car. It still bothers me." She would have been having this interview as an elderly woman. Apparently, some kids were so traumatized by what they saw. The stories around here are that some people even left Gibbsland for good. I think what Henderson Jordan did to those children is unspeakable. Took quite a while for them to get to Arcadia, and by the time they did, 16,000 people had swarmed into the streets of Arcadia outside Conger's furniture and funeral home, which was the destination of the wrecker, and to get a glimpse of the corpses inside the car. It was about 11:30 when they got there, so it took a little over 2 hours.